What we are watching unfold in real time as we move into the third week of January 2026 is not merely a trade dispute. It is not even primarily about tariffs. What we are witnessing is the structural reorganization of the post-World War II international order, and like most systemic transformations, it will feel sudden to those who have not been paying attention to the underlying architecture. Today, Saturday, January 18th, President Trump announced 10% tariffs on 8 NATO allies: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland, to take effect February 1st, escalating to 25% by June if no agreement is reached for what he calls the complete and total purchase of Greenland. European leaders from Emmanuel Macron to Ursula von der Leyen have responded with condemnation and promises of coordinated retaliation. Protesters marched through the streets of Copenhagen and Nuuk chanting the Greenlandic name for their homeland, Kalalit Nunat. And somewhere in Brussels, officials are dusting off a regulatory instrument called the Anti-Coercion Instrument, adopted in late 2023 but never yet deployed, specifically designed for precisely this moment of economic weaponization between supposed allies. I am not a financial advisor. This is not financial advice. This is an educational analysis based on publicly available information and historical precedent. To understand why this particular confrontation carries systemic implications that extend far beyond the immediate question of Greenland's sovereignty, we must understand the architecture of the system that is now being stress-tested. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established in April 1949, not merely as a military alliance, but as the institutional embodiment of a strategic bargain. The United States would extend its nuclear umbrella over Western Europe. In exchange, European nations would align economically and politically with Washington, accepting American leadership in security matters while benefiting from access to the American market and the stability of the dollar-denominated trading system. This arrangement, formalized through the Marshall Plan and later through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, created what economists call an interlocking system of incentives. Military security, economic access, and political alignment became mutually reinforcing. For 75 years, this architecture held, surviving the Berlin crises, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, and the eastward expansion that brought former Warsaw Pact nations into the Western fold. The system was tested repeatedly, but it was never fundamentally challenged from within by the hegemon that created it. What makes the current moment structurally different is that the challenge now comes from the center, not the periphery. When we examine historical precedents for the unraveling of alliance systems, the relevant cases are not the slow peripheral erosions, but the sudden shocks originating from core members. The concert of Europe did not collapse because small states defected. It collapsed when the great powers themselves began pursuing policies incompatible with the system's foundational assumptions. The gold standard did not fail because peripheral economies abandoned it. It failed when Britain, the system's anchor, could no longer sustain its commitments. Systems designed for cooperation become fragile precisely when the parties with the greatest stake in maintaining them begin to question whether the benefits still outweigh the costs. The economic historian Barry Eichengreen, studying interwar monetary arrangements, identified what he called credibility cascades, moments when doubts about one party's commitment to the rules spread rapidly to doubts about the entire system. Once market participants began questioning whether Britain would maintain gold convertibility, they simultaneously began questioning whether anyone would. The system did not unwind gradually. It unraveled in a matter of months in 1931. We should consider whether we are now witnessing a credibility cascade in the transatlantic security and economic architecture. The immediate trigger, Greenland, is simultaneously stranger and more logical than it might first appear. The Arctic island, home to approximately 57,000 people and covering more than 836,000 square miles, has been a Danish territory since the early 18th century and achieved expanded self-governance in 2009. Trump's interest in acquiring it, first expressed during his initial administration and now pursued with renewed intensity, reflects several converging strategic calculations. Greenland ranks 8th globally in rare earth reserves with 1.5 million metric tons and contains some of the world's largest deposits of these minerals essential for electric vehicles, wind turbines, and defense technologies. The European Commission identified 25 of the 34 minerals on its critical raw materials list as present in Greenland. As Arctic ice recedes due to climate change, new shipping routes are becoming viable. The Northwest Passage and Northern Sea Route could reduce transit times between Asia and Europe by 40 to 50% compared to the Suez Canal route. And strategically, Greenland anchors the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, the critical maritime choke point for monitoring surface and submarine naval activities between the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans. The Patuxent Space Base, America's northernmost military installation, provides missile detection and space surveillance capabilities essential to continental defense. These are legitimate strategic considerations. But the method of pursuit, imposing punitive tariffs on NATO allies, explicitly conditioning their removal on territorial acquisition, and refusing to rule out military force against a fellow alliance member, represents a fundamental departure from the operational logic that has governed Western relations since 1949. Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen stated after meeting with American officials earlier this week that Washington's position is essentially that of conquest. When Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson declares that his nation will not be blackmailed, when France's Macron states that no intimidation will influence European choices, when even Republican senators like Lisa Murkowski and Tom Tillis publicly condemn their own president's approach as bad for America and its allies, we are witnessing something more significant than a trade negotiation. We are witnessing the articulation of red lines. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 offers the most instructive historical parallel, not because the economic conditions are identical, but because it demonstrates how protectionist measures can cascade through interconnected systems in ways their architects do not anticipate. In June 1930, President Herbert Hoover signed legislation raising tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods, increasing average rates on dutiable imports from roughly 40% to nearly 60%. The stated goal was to protect American farmers and workers from foreign competition during the early stages of the Great Depression. More than 1,000 economists signed a petition urging Hoover to veto the legislation, warning of precisely what subsequently occurred. Canada, America's largest trading partner, immediately imposed countervailing duties on American goods while lowering tariffs on imports from the British Empire. Within 2 years, over 24 countries had adopted similar retaliatory measures. Global trade collapsed by 65% between 1929 and 1934. The Smoot-Hawley tariff did not cause the Great Depression. Financial instability, falling demand, and poor banking practices had already triggered the downturn, but it deepened and prolonged the crisis by shrinking international commerce and accelerating the fragmentation of the global economy into hostile trading blocs. The parallel is not exact. Today's global economy is far more interconnected than that of the 1930s. Trade accounted for only 16% of global goods output then. It represents 60% today. Trade's importance to the American economy itself has increased from 5% of gross domestic product in 1930 to roughly 25% now. The United States ships approximately $3 trillion worth of goods and services annually, supporting over 40 million American jobs. This deeper integration means that tariff wars today carry more significant economic consequences, affecting complex supply chains that span continents. But the deeper integration also creates more points of potential retaliation and more constituencies with interests in maintaining the existing order. The European Union possesses instruments its 1930s predecessors did not. The Anti-Coercion instrument, adopted in November 2023 and entering force that December, was designed specifically to address situations where a third country seeks to pressure the European Union or a member state into making particular policy choices by applying or threatening to apply measures affecting trade or investment. The instrument allows the Commission to impose response measures, including customs duties, restrictions on trade in goods and services, reduced access to the EU market, controls on foreign investment, and restrictions on intellectual property rights. It was developed in response to experiences including American sanctions against European companies involved in Nord Stream 2 and China's trade restrictions against Lithuania after that country improved relations with Taiwan. The irony that a tool designed partly in response to Trump's first administration may now be deployed against his second is not lost on European policymakers. The question confronting European leaders is whether to deploy this instrument and, if so, how aggressively. European Council President Antonio Costa has stated that the bloc is coordinating a joint response. Commission President von der Leyen has warned that additional tariffs would undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. The language matters. Spiral implies awareness that retaliation begets counter-retaliation, that once begun, such cycles are difficult to arrest. The Smoot-Hawley experience demonstrated that even when all parties recognize the mutual harm of trade warfare, the political economy of protectionism creates constituencies for escalation. Farmers who have received protection lobby against its removal. Industries that have benefited from reduced foreign competition resist the return to open markets. What begins as a tactical measure to gain negotiating leverage can become entrenched policy with its own defenders. The Supreme Court's pending decision on whether Trump can legally impose tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act adds another dimension of uncertainty. The administration has relied heavily on this authority to impose nation-by-nation tariffs, declaring various emergencies related to fentanyl, trade imbalances, and now apparently Arctic security. If the justices rule against the administration, and reporting suggests they appeared skeptical during oral arguments, it would strip the president of his primary mechanism for these measures and potentially require the refunding of billions in tariff payments already collected. But such a ruling would come too late to prevent the damage to alliance relationships that is already occurring. Trust, once broken, is not restored by judicial intervention. Most people observing these developments will miss the systemic implications because they are accustomed to treating trade disputes as discrete events with beginnings and endings, winners and losers, agreements eventually reached. The trade war with China during Trump's first administration followed this pattern. Escalation, negotiation, a Phase 1 deal, tensions managed if not resolved. Observers expect the Greenland tariffs to follow a similar trajectory. Pressure applied, concessions obtained or not, some equilibrium restored. This expectation fundamentally misreads the nature of what is occurring. The post-World War II order was built on the assumption that the United States would accept certain costs, including trade deficits, security expenditures, and constraints on unilateral action, in exchange for the benefits of leadership, access to resources, influence over international institutions, the privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency. This bargain required that European allies accept American leadership and align their policies accordingly. Both sides made sacrifices. Both sides received benefits. What we are witnessing now is the unilateral renegotiation of these terms by one party, without consultation, without recognition that the other parties also possess agency and alternatives. When Trump writes on social media that Denmark is a tiny country with a tiny economy and a tiny military that cannot defend Greenland, he is stating a fact. But facts without context can mislead. Denmark is also a founding member of NATO, which obligates all 32 members to treat an attack on one as an attack on all. When European troops begin arriving in Greenland, as they did this week, with German Bundeswehr personnel and Swedish military officers participating in Operation Arctic Endurance, they are not merely conducting routine exercises. They are demonstrating that the alliance retains meaning, that Article 5 creates mutual obligations, that sovereignty is defended collectively. The Danish Major General commanding Joint Arctic Command stated explicitly that he would never expect a NATO country to attack another NATO country. The fact that he felt compelled to say this out loud tells us how far we have traveled from normal assumptions. The economic consequences of tariff escalation are calculable, but also inevitably incomplete. If 10% tariffs on 8 European nations take effect on February 1st and 25% tariffs follow on June 1st, the immediate impact will fall on specific sectors: European automobiles, pharmaceuticals, machinery, agricultural products. American consumers will pay higher prices. European exporters will lose market share. Supply chains that have developed over decades, optimized for efficiency rather than geopolitical resilience, will face disruption. The Northern Trust research team estimates that compared to the 1930s, today's far greater trade integration would make tariff wars significantly more damaging, affecting production, investment, and employment across both continents. But these calculations, however sophisticated, cannot capture the second-order effects: the investments not made because of uncertainty, the partnerships not formed because of distrust, the innovations not pursued because resources were diverted to navigating a fragmenting trade environment. History suggests that these second-order effects ultimately matter more than the direct impacts. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs themselves, in strict quantitative terms, may have reduced American output by only 1 to 2%, a modest effect relative to the overall Depression-era contraction. But by destroying the cooperative framework that might have enabled coordinated responses to the crisis, by encouraging countries to pursue beggar-thy-neighbor policies rather than collective action, by fostering the economic nationalism that fed political extremism, the tariffs contributed to a decade of disaster whose consequences extended far beyond any specific trade measure. The monetary economist Milton Friedman, no opponent of free markets, argued that the tariffs' greatest damage was not economic but political, the shattering of international cooperation at the moment it was most needed. We face a similar risk today, compounded by structural vulnerabilities the 1930s did not possess. The global financial system is more leveraged. Government debt levels are higher. The instruments for economic warfare are more sophisticated, ranging from tariffs and sanctions to export controls and restrictions on critical technology. China has demonstrated with its rare earth export restrictions and its pressure on various trading partners that economic interdependence can be weaponized. Russia has shown through energy cutoffs and cyber operations that infrastructure dependencies create strategic vulnerabilities. The United States itself has deployed financial sanctions with increasing frequency, exploiting the dollar's reserve currency status to project power in ways that encourage others to seek alternatives. The system that once produced mutual benefits through cooperation is increasingly being used by each major power to extract concessions from the others. The people who will feel these effects most acutely are, as always, not the policymakers or the financial analysts, but ordinary citizens whose employment, savings, and opportunities depend on economic conditions they cannot control. When global trade collapsed in the early 1930s, it was not bankers who suffered most, but farmers who could not sell their crops, factory workers who lost their jobs, small business owners who watched their customers disappear. The parallels to our present moment are imperfect but instructive. American farmers who export to Europe, European workers in export-oriented industries, consumers on both continents who depend on imported goods, these are the constituencies who will bear the costs of escalation while having the least voice in the decisions that produce it. The common objection to this analysis is that Trump is merely negotiating, that the tariffs are threats intended to extract concessions, that once Denmark agrees to some acceptable arrangement regarding Greenland, perhaps enhanced American investment, perhaps expanded basing rights, perhaps some formula that preserves nominal Danish sovereignty while granting Washington the access it seeks, the pressure will be lifted and normalcy will resume. This objection misunderstands both the nature of the demands and the damage already done. Denmark and Greenland have stated repeatedly that sovereignty is not for sale. Polls show 85% of Greenlanders oppose joining the United States. The Greenlandic premier has made clear that it is only for the Greenlandic people to determine their own future. These are not opening positions in a negotiation. They are expressions of fundamental values regarding self-determination and territorial integrity. When the Trump administration refuses to rule out military force to acquire the territory of a NATO ally, when Stephen Miller's wife posts an image of Greenland colored as the American flag with the word soon, when administration officials describe Denmark's legitimate deployment of forces to its own territory as playing a very dangerous game for the safety, security, and survival of our planet, the message received by European capitals is not that Washington is negotiating, but that Washington views its allies as subordinates whose sovereignty is conditional on American approval. The former NATO Secretary General and former Danish Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen characterized Trump's approach as speaking like a gangster, using Greenland as a weapon of mass distraction. This language from a conservative former leader of the alliance reflects how profoundly the American position has violated established norms. Even if the immediate crisis is somehow resolved, even if tariffs are never implemented or quickly reversed, the revelation of American willingness to coerce allies through economic pressure and implied military threats will reshape European strategic calculations for a generation. The European Union's response will determine much about what comes next. If member states remain united, deploying coordinated countermeasures through the anti-coercion instrument and other available mechanisms, they may establish that economic coercion against the bloc carries unacceptable costs. If they fragment, with some states seeking bilateral accommodations with Washington while others resist, the result will be precisely the division that strengthens coercive leverage. Early indications suggest unity. France, Germany, Sweden, and others have all condemned the tariff threats. But unity is easier to proclaim than to maintain, especially when the costs of confrontation begin to materialize in specific industries and constituencies. The broader systemic question is whether the transatlantic relationship can survive this stress test in any recognizable form. NATO has weathered internal crises before. France's withdrawal from the Integrated Military Command in 1966, recurring disputes over burden sharing, disagreements over particular military interventions. But those crises occurred within a framework where all parties accepted the basic legitimacy of the alliance and the constraints it imposed on unilateral action. What we are witnessing now is different. The largest and most powerful member openly treating alliance commitments as instruments of leverage rather than binding obligations, using economic coercion against fellow members to pursue territorial objectives they have clearly and democratically rejected. The American Enterprise Institute recently observed that NATO has dodged collapse before, but has never been this close. The four convergent crises they identify: Russian aggression creating genuine security threats in Europe, European military weakness after decades of underinvestment, the shifting American focus toward the Indo-Pacific, and now the credibility crisis regarding American commitments, create conditions unlike any the alliance has previously faced. A scenario in which Trump continues to pervert NATO by threatening the territorial integrity of its members, in which unresolved trade wars create a poisonous transatlantic climate, in which American troops are withdrawn to punish European countries or shift focus to Asia, in which Ukraine is abandoned and right-wing figures sympathetic to Russia are elevated. Such a scenario would make the alliance a dead letter without requiring formal withdrawal. For those watching these developments and wondering how they will unfold, the honest answer is that prediction with any precision is impossible. Complex systems under stress exhibit path dependencies. Small differences in initial conditions or intermediate events can produce vastly different outcomes. What we can say with confidence is that the structural preconditions for significant disruption are present, that the actions being taken increase rather than decrease systemic risk, and that historical parallels suggest the potential consequences extend far beyond what most observers currently anticipate. The 1930s demonstrated that international economic systems can unravel faster than anyone expects once the psychological threshold of cooperation is breached. The transition from the relatively stable late 1920s to the fragmented hostile trading blocs of the mid-1930s took only 4 to 5 years. The political consequences followed, not inevitably, but with a logic that becomes clear only in retrospect. Economic nationalism fed political extremism. Competitive devaluations and tariff wars created zero-sum dynamics that poisoned diplomatic relationships. The institutions designed to promote cooperation were discredited or bypassed. By the time leaders recognized the danger, the momentum toward conflict had become self-sustaining. We are not in the 1930s. The international architecture is different. Nuclear weapons have transformed the calculations of great power conflict. Economic interdependence runs far deeper. But the underlying dynamics, the weaponization of economic relationships, the erosion of trust between supposed partners, the prioritization of short-term tactical advantage over long-term systemic stability, follow patterns that historians recognize. The ghost of Smoot-Hawley, as one economist recently put it, seems to haunt the present moment. What happens over the next weeks and months will determine whether this crisis becomes an inflection point or a footnote. If Europe maintains unity and responds with calibrated firmness, establishing that coercion carries costs, while leaving doors open for genuine negotiation, some equilibrium may be restored. If the alliance fragments, if bilateral deals undermine collective responses, if the lesson drawn by future actors is that economic pressure on allies produces results, then we will have entered a new and far more dangerous phase of international relations. For those seeking to understand rather than merely react, the essential insight is this: the crisis over Greenland is not about Greenland. It is about whether the institutional architecture that has governed Western relations since 1949 can survive its greatest internal challenge. The tariffs announced today are not merely trade measures. They are tests of systemic resilience, and the responses being formulated in European capitals this weekend will shape the international environment for decades to come. We are watching history happen with all the uncertainty and consequence that phrase implies.